England, January 6, 1944. The war in Europe has entered its fourth brutal winter. For nearly 2 years, the skies above Germany had been a killing ground where American bombers vanish in black smoke and twisted aluminum. Major General Jimmy Doolittle reads it in silence. He's been in command for less than 24 hours. He turns to his chief of staff, Major General William Kepner. Doolittle, calm but firm. That sign needs to come down. It's wrong. Moments later, a new one replaces it. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. That one sentence, 16 words, would reshape the air war over Europe. It was not just a change in tactics, it was a declaration of war on the Luftwaffe itself. He was no stranger to risk. The man who had led the audacious Doolittle Raid on Tokyo in 1942 was part engineer, part fighter ace, and part scientist. He'd earned a Ph.D. in aeronautical engineering from MIT and held every kind of pilot's license America had ever invented. Doolittle knew airplanes, their power, their weaknesses, their psychology. He also knew that the U.S. 8th Air Force was bleeding to death in the skies of Germany. By the end of 1943, bomber losses were catastrophic. Entire squadrons had been wiped out on missions over Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Crews called it the flak trap, where steel rain fell so thick you could walk on it. And Doolittle's orders from General Hap Arnold were simple: fix it, or the bombing campaign dies. The man who had once bombed Tokyo with a handful of B-25s would now fight to save thousands of airmen, not by defending them, but by hunting the hunters. This is how one mad general broke the back of the Luftwaffe in less than 6 months. In late 1943, American air power faced its darkest moment. Every daylight raid over Germany came at a cost that could not be sustained. The numbers were grim. Over 600 bombers lost on the October 14th Schweinfurt Raid alone. 600 men missing, captured, or dead in one mission. Crews began to call it Black Thursday. Escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could only fly so far. 200 miles past the channel, their fuel gauges dropped into the red. They'd circle, wave, and turn back, leaving the bombers alone for the final deadly stretch. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German radar operators watched the bomber streams cross the Dutch coast. Squadrons of FW-190s and Me-109s scrambled to intercept, guided by ground controllers who knew every minute of the American route. They didn't attack piecemeal. They waited until the escort fighters peeled away, then swarmed. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of German fighters converged in timed waves. First came the fast-slashing Me-109s to break formation. Then the heavy Sturmgruppen, armored FW-190s carrying 30mm cannons, moving in close, head-on. It was an execution. A B-17 crew had seconds to react, just enough time to shout, "Bandits, 12 o'clock!" before the first cannon shells tore through the nose. They came straight at us, whole wings on fire. I saw one hit the lead ship. It exploded before my eyes. In the autumn of '43, less than half of bomber crews survived a full 25-mission tour. Losses climbed to 30% per major operation. Commanders began to fear what they would not say aloud. If this continued, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist by spring. American doctrine insisted that tight box formations and defensive firepower could protect themselves, a theory known as the combat box. In practice, it turned bomber groups into slow-moving targets. Each fortress carried up to 13 heavy machine guns, but when 30 or 40 German fighters attacked in coordinated passes, the math was hopeless. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, said, "The fortress can defend itself," they said, "but it can't defend against hell." General Ira Eaker, Doolittle's predecessor, believed daylight precision bombing could win the war, but his doctrine was built on hope and arithmetic, not experience. He believed in the fortress. Doolittle believed in the fighter. By the end of 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost over 2,000 heavy bombers and nearly 20,000 airmen. In Washington, there were quiet talks of abandoning the bombing campaign altogether. Then, on January 6, 1944, the day Doolittle replaced Eaker, that idea died. He didn't come to defend bombers. He came to destroy the Luftwaffe. And he had the perfect weapon to do it. The P-51 Mustang. Fast, long-ranged, deadly. A machine built not to protect, but to hunt. When Doolittle arrived in England, he inherited a nightmare. A crippled bombing campaign, exhausted crews, and fighter escorts that could barely reach the German border. But in the hangars of the 354th Fighter Group, a new machine was waiting. It was the airplane that would change everything. Sleek, fast, and beautiful, the P-51 Mustang. Born from a desperate British request in 1940, the Mustang had been an experiment, an American airframe powered by a British heart, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. That combination produced something new, a fighter that could climb higher, fly farther, and fight longer than anything else in the sky. With 2 drop tanks attached, the P-51 could escort bombers deep into Germany, to Berlin and back, a distance no American fighter had ever covered. It cruised at 437 miles per hour, could reach 41,000 feet, and still had the agility to outturn and outclimb the Luftwaffe's best. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager. The Mustang could do it all. Outrun, outfight, and outfly anything Jerry had. It wasn't just speed, it was the psychology. The Luftwaffe had grown used to watching American escorts turn back over Belgium or the Rhine. Now, suddenly, the little silver-bellied Mustangs kept coming. They followed the bombers all the way to the target, and then they stayed, waiting. In Doolittle's hands, the Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a scalpel. The 8th Air Force could finally reach the Luftwaffe's heart, its airfields, its training centers, its veteran squadrons, anywhere inside the Reich. For the bomber crews who had flown through hell alone, those words were more than paint. They were survival. But Doolittle didn't just want to escort bombers. He wanted to break the Luftwaffe, to kill it in the air, on the ground, and in the factories that fed it. To do that, he would need to tear up the rulebook that had governed the air war since the beginning. Before Doolittle, the 8th Air Force fought under a rigid doctrine, one built by bomber generals, not fighter pilots. It was called the escort doctrine. Fighters were ordered to stay close, to orbit the bomber columns and fend off attacks. Their duty, in the words of the old headquarters plaque, was to bring the bombers back alive. On paper, it made sense, but in practice, it was suicide. Fighter pilots described it as flying with one hand tied behind your back. They were forbidden to chase the enemy. If a German formation broke off and climbed away, American fighters had to watch, because straying too far from the bombers meant court-martial. The Luftwaffe learned that pattern fast. They would attack from altitude, dive through the formation, then climb back into the clouds, safe from pursuit. The escorts couldn't touch them. Every time a B-17 went down, 10 men vanished with it. Every one of those men was a trained specialist, gunner, navigator, radio operator, months of preparation, gone in seconds. By late 1943, even the bomber generals could see the truth. The defensive theory wasn't working. The Luftwaffe wasn't being worn down. It was getting stronger. And then came Doolittle's new order, radical, almost reckless. From now on, your mission is not to defend the bombers. Your mission is to destroy the Luftwaffe. If you see a German fighter, go get him." That single directive overturned the entire doctrine of American air power. No more hovering above the formations like sheepdogs. Fighters would now range ahead, 50 miles in front, 25 miles to each side, hunting German interceptors before they could reach the bombers. And when the bombers turned for home, the fighters would not return with them. They would dive down, low, over German airfields and attack anything with wings or wheels. Fuel trucks, trains, aircraft on the ground. Doolittle's fighters called it rhubarb hunting. The Germans called it terror from above. For the first time, American fighters were not protecting the air campaign. They were the air campaign. The reaction was immediate and divided. Bomber crews thought Doolittle was insane. Without close escort, they said, the bombers would be massacred. But the fighter pilots, men like Don Blakeslee of the 4th Fighter Group, called it liberation. Colonel Don Blakeslee, "Finally, they're letting us fight the way we're supposed to fight." Doolittle's gamble was clear. To win the air war, he had to lure the Luftwaffe into battle and destroy it where it lived. The new orders went out across England. In a matter of days, entire squadrons were retrained. Maps of Germany were redrawn not by target cities, but by enemy airbase locations. Every pilot knew the risk. If they left the bombers too soon and a formation got hit, the responsibility would be theirs. But Doolittle trusted them, trusted their judgment, their aggression, their skill. He was betting the lives of thousands of airmen on the instincts of a few hundred fighter pilots. And on January 29, 1944, the experiment would begin. The hunters were airborne, and the Luftwaffe had no idea what was coming. By the last week of January 1944, Jimmy Doolittle's revolution was in motion. Across dozens of airfields in East Anglia, hundreds of P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s waited on the frost-covered tarmac. Their orders were clear, and unlike anything the 8th Air Force had ever flown before. No more defensive escort patterns, no more circling the bombers like anxious sentries. From now on, they would hunt. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, 56th Fighter Group. We were told, go out, find the enemy, and kill him. That was the new law of the sky. Each group had a designated free hunt corridor, a zone ahead of the bomber streams where they could roam, attack, and pursue without restraint. They'd race 50, sometimes 100 miles ahead of the bomber formations, diving into the Luftwaffe's assembly routes before the German fighters could even climb to altitude. This was a tactical ambush, a reversal of everything the enemy had been trained to expect. For months, Luftwaffe controllers had watched bomber formations approach on radar, then timed their own interceptors to rise and strike at a set altitude, perfectly predictable. Now the German system began to unravel. The new American tactic meant that by the time the Luftwaffe scrambled, the Mustangs were already there, waiting, circling above their airfields like hawks. On January 29, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first deep penetration raid under Doolittle's command, a massive strike on Frankfurt, Brunswick, and Hanover. German controllers expected the usual slow climb and bomber-heavy formation. Instead, the first radar returns showed dozens of fast-moving blips racing ahead of the bombers, independent, aggressive, unpredictable. The Luftwaffe didn't understand it yet, but the hunters had arrived. Lieutenant Robert Goebel, 31st Fighter Group. We came in at 20,000 feet, saw a gaggle of FW-190s forming up below us. We dropped our tanks and went straight through them. They never knew what hit them. Within minutes, 15 German fighters were down. The Mustangs lost none. For the first time, the 8th Air Force's bombers reached their targets and came home without catastrophic loss. Over the next weeks, the change was unmistakable. Fighter squadrons began reporting kill ratios of 5 to 1, sometimes higher. German pilots complained of being attacked during takeoff, landing, even taxiing on their own fields. The psychological toll was immediate. Luftwaffe morale, already strained, began to crack. One German ace wrote in his diary, "The Americans are no longer flying by rules. They appear from the clouds like wolves." Doolittle's strategy was pure aggression, but it was also precision warfare. He understood that destroying the Luftwaffe didn't just mean shooting down planes. It meant cutting out the veteran corps, the trained, experienced fighter leaders who held the German defense together. Every time a Staffelkapitän or Gruppenkommander went down, it left a hole that could not be filled. Germany was producing new planes faster than ever, but not new pilots. By February 1944, the Luftwaffe was beginning to bleed expertise faster than it could replace it, and Doolittle was about to push that wound wide open. On February 20th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, better known by its code name, Big Week. It was the largest coordinated air offensive in history, a joint campaign between the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces designed to destroy the heart of Germany's aircraft industry. For 6 days, waves of bombers, B-17s and B-24s pounded every major aviation plant in the Reich: Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Augsburg, Leipzig, and Stuttgart. Their escorts? Doolittle's Mustangs. This was the ultimate test of his new doctrine. The plan was brutal in its simplicity: force the Luftwaffe to rise and fight, over and over until it shattered. Day 1, over 1,000 bombers crossed into Germany. Luftwaffe interceptors scrambled for more than 100 bases, but this time when they climbed to meet the bombers, they met the Mustangs first. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, 352nd Fighter Group. We caught them forming up. I saw 20, maybe 30 109s below. We rolled in and hit them head on. It was chaos, smoke, tracers, pieces of wings flying past the cockpit. The Luftwaffe lost over 60 fighters that day. American bomber losses were heavy, but sustainable. Day 2, the offensive continued. Factories at Brunswick and Gotha burned. The Germans threw everything they had, fresh pilots, training units, even test aircraft, into the fight. It was a massacre. By day 3, the Luftwaffe's elite Jagdgeschwader 26 and JG-54 were flying half-strength. Maintenance crews were overrun, spare parts exhausted, fuel reserves collapsing. The turning point came on February 23rd. While bombers struck Gotha, Doolittle's Mustangs went for the jugular, the Luftwaffe's airfields themselves. Hundreds of P-51s swept low over German bases at Braunschweig, Gießen, and Münster. They strafed hangars, fuel depots, parked aircraft, anything that could move. Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakeslee. We went in at treetop level, guns blazing. I saw one FW-190 trying to take off. He never made it. The whole field was on fire before we pulled up. The attack was devastating. In 3 days, over 350 German aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 450 fighters and 100 veteran pilots, men who could never be replaced. German aircraft production was crippled for months. And though American bomber losses reached 244 aircraft, the message was unmistakable. The Luftwaffe was broken. We've drawn them out. We've beaten their best. From here on, it's only a matter of time. After Big Week, the Luftwaffe never fully recovered. Its veteran corps was gone, its command system shaken, and its morale fractured. The air war over Europe had turned. The hunters had done their work. The bombers would keep flying, but for the first time since the war began, they did so with clear skies. because men like Doolittle had taken the fight to the enemy's doorstep and won. When the smoke of Big Week cleared, the German fighter arm was still alive, but mortally wounded. Between February and April 1944, Jimmy Doolittle pressed the attack with surgical precision. He knew that the Luftwaffe's collapse would not come from one decisive battle, but from exhaustion, from destroying its ability to stand back up. Each week, Allied raids pushed further east. Each week, the Mustangs went with them, striking airfields, rail lines, convoys, and training bases. Germany's fighter training pipeline was breaking down. Before 1944, a German pilot trained for 200 hours before combat. By March, it was less than 120. By May, some new pilots had barely 80 hours in the air. They were sent up in brand new FW-190As and Me-109Gs, machines they barely knew how to fly. Oberleutnant Heinz Schnaufer, German night fighter ace, diary. We no longer train pilots, we throw them into the sky and see if they survive. Meanwhile, the Allied fighter groups were maturing fast. Pilots like Yeager, Blakeslee, and Preddy had become hunters in the purest sense, reading enemy tactics, coordinating in radio silence, using altitude and sun angles to dictate every fight. Captain John Godfrey, 4th Fighter Group. We stopped reacting to them. Now they were reacting to us. By mid-March 1944, the Mustang's kill ratio had soared beyond 8-to-1. Entire Luftwaffe Geschwader were being erased from combat records. The Audeville boys, the once feared JG-26, was down to a handful of flyable aircraft. Even worse for Germany, the Mustangs were now hitting what the bombers could not, the fuel. In March and April 1944, fighter bombers of the 8th and 9th Air Forces turned their attention to the synthetic oil plants at Luna, Lütgendorf, and Politz. Every storage tank that burned tightened the noose on the Luftwaffe's fuel supply. Without aviation gasoline, no amount of new aircraft could save them. By April, German pilots were rationed to just 40 liters per training flight. Some took off once a week, and then only for 10 minutes. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous. Its Me-109s and FW-190s could still kill, but the initiative was gone. Every engagement now began on American terms. Doolittle's new philosophy had become instinct. Attack first, attack hard, and never let the enemy choose the battlefield. He once said, "If you're not offensive, you're defeated before you start." That spirit now defined the entire 8th Air Force. By April 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost control of its own skies. Fuel shortages, training failures, and continuous attacks left it crippled. And in a few short weeks, the Allies would need that superiority for the greatest invasion of the war. By May 1944, the air war over Europe was transformed. What had begun as a battle for survival had become a campaign of dominance. For the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe could no longer mount organized resistance over Western Europe. Its fighter force was a skeleton, out of fuel, out of leaders, out of time. The numbers tell the story. In January 1944, German fighter production peaked at nearly 3,000 aircraft per month. By June, that output meant nothing, because Allied fighters were destroying 1,000 of them every week on the ground. And with the skies clear, the Allies could begin the next phase of the war, Operation Overlord. In the weeks before D-Day, Doolittle's fighters and the tactical air forces of the 9th Air Force turned their attention to France. Their mission was not glory, it was denial. Deny the enemy movement, denial of resupply, denial of reinforcement. Every bridge, rail line, and marshalling yard from the Rhine to the Seine became a target. Mustangs and Thunderbolts raked train lines with rockets and cannons, turning the German transport network into a graveyard of iron and smoke. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, "We weren't just flying cover, we were building the runway for D-Day." The results were staggering. By June 1, 1944, German rail traffic in northern France was down by 70%. The Luftwaffe had barely 300 serviceable fighters left in the entire Western theater. Most were hidden in forests or camouflaged under netting, fuel too scarce to fly. On the morning of June 6, 1944, when the Allied Armada crossed the Channel, Doolittle's fighters rose with them. Nearly 12,000 Allied aircraft filled the sky, the largest aerial armada ever assembled. Fighter groups flew in shifts, maintaining a constant umbrella over the beaches of Normandy. The Luftwaffe appeared, briefly. A handful of Mess 109s and FW-190s made isolated sorties before being swarmed and shot down. By noon, the skies belonged entirely to the Allies. German pilot report, Jagdschwadron 26. "We could not reach the invasion. We had no fuel. The sky was lost." The invasion of Europe was not won on the beaches alone. It was won in the month before, in the thin, cold air above Germany, when Doolittle and his pilots tore the Luftwaffe from the sky and ended its power to fight. From that day on, the Allies would command the air. Every tank that moved, every train that rolled, every convoy that dared to travel by day did so under the eye of the Mustang. Doolittle's offensive had fulfilled its purpose. The hunters had won the sky. By the summer of 1944, the once proud Luftwaffe, the hammer of Blitzkrieg, the terror of Europe, was broken. It had begun the war as the most advanced air arm on Earth. By 1944, it was a shattered remnant, exhausted pilots, no fuel, and no sky to fight in. In June, German commanders made a grim admission. Their fighter reserves were gone. Pilots were being sent to the front after just 2 weeks of training. Some flew without having ever fired their guns in practice. The Luftwaffe still had aircraft, thousands of them, but most sat silent for lack of gasoline or oil. What little fuel remained was diverted to tanks, leaving fighters grounded in the fields where they had once ruled the air. Oberst Adolf Galland, Luftwaffe general, post-war testimony. "We had fine airplanes, but we could not fly them. The Americans had taken the sky away from us." Every mile the Allies advanced was watched from above. Every bridge destroyed, every convoy scattered, every German division slowed, because Doolittle's airmen controlled what no army could reach, the air itself. The Luftwaffe's final attempt to regain control came with desperation. In September 1944, they launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise New Year's Day attack on Allied airfields in the Low Countries. Hundreds of German fighters roared in at low altitude, strafing runways and parked aircraft. It was bold and catastrophic. Nearly 300 German aircraft were destroyed in a single day, along with 200 veteran pilots. The Luftwaffe would never recover. American ground crewmen after Bodenplatte. "We walked the field the next morning. There were burned planes everywhere, theirs and ours. But when the sun came up, we took off again. They didn't." By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a ghost. When Allied bombers crossed into Germany, resistance came from scattered, inexperienced units, boys barely out of flight school, flying outdated fighters. Jet aircraft like the Me-262 appeared too late, too few, and with too little fuel to change the outcome. Each time a squadron launched, Mustangs were waiting over their bases. The German skies, once filled with defiant black crosses, were now ruled by silver wings. When the war ended in May 1945, the Luftwaffe's losses were staggering. Over 40,000 aircraft destroyed, half of them fighters, and nearly 30,000 pilots killed. It had taken less than 6 months for Doolittle's offensive to achieve what no Allied bombing campaign alone could accomplish: to dismantle the enemy's air power at its core. From that moment forward, every major Allied operation, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, and across the Rhine, was carried out under friendly skies, and the name Doolittle became synonymous with a new kind of warfare. James Harold Doolittle never claimed to be a conqueror. He was, above all, a pilot, a man who understood the machine, the mission, and the mind. But what he accomplished between January and June 1944 changed air warfare forever. Before Doolittle, air combat had been governed by defense: protect the bombers, hold the line, endure. After Doolittle, it became offense: seize the initiative, hunt the enemy, control the sky. His doctrine was simple but absolute. Air power cannot win if it waits. It must strike first, strike fast, and strike deep. That philosophy became the foundation of modern air warfare, from Korea to Vietnam, from Desert Storm to today. Every modern air campaign, every air superiority operation traces its lineage back to those cold mornings over Germany in 1944. Doolittle's ideas, freedom of action, offensive interception, total air dominance, became universal truths of aviation strategy. General Curtis LeMay, post-war address. Jimmy Doolittle taught us that the best defense is destruction. He taught us that air superiority is not a right, it's something you take and hold. Even the enemy acknowledged his genius. In post-war interviews, Luftwaffe aces like Adolf Deland and Günter Rahl spoke with reluctant admiration. They called him the general who understood fighters. Doolittle's leadership style was unlike any other general's. He trusted his men, not just as soldiers, but as thinkers. He gave them freedom, the latitude to improvise, to adapt, to fight their way. That trust created the most lethal generation of fighter pilots the world had ever seen. They called themselves the Little Friends. They came to the rescue of every bomber crew that saw their silver wings glinting in the sun. But they were more than escorts. They were the hunters, the men who broke the Luftwaffe's back and made victory possible. Pilots led her home, read softly. "We don't fly for medals. We fly so that the boys in those bombers make it home." By the end of the war, Doolittle returned home not just as a hero of Tokyo or the savior of the 8th Air Force, but as the man who rewrote the laws of air combat. He had proven a truth that would echo across generations, that in war, as in the air, initiative is life, and the sky belongs to those who dare to seize it. This has been Doolittle, the general who broke the Luftwaffe, the story of a man, a machine, and a doctrine that changed the course of history and won the sky for freedom.